3. In June 2014, S.B. Tang wrote, and I quote, 22 years ago, a young newspaper reporter in Melbourne quit his job and changed the face of Australian cricket writing forever. I'm grateful. End quote. We are grateful too. Trust me, Mr. S.B. Tang. From churning out his first ever book, the most insightful one on the Packer era, with virtually no access to cricketers to start with, and after being rejected by 11 publishers, soon after being in a situation where he was literally surviving on breakfast cereal, to churning out the most brilliant book on Shane Warne, who passed away on this day last year in just 1 month, consisting of 31 days. This writer has combined fascinating perspective and intellectual heavy lifting to become a voice of cricket which will survive and thrive for as long as cricket does and much beyond too. He scheduled his wedding in the Australian local cricket off-season, his honeymoon in the cricket season break, and his child arrived by providence in the mid-season break. His t-shirt collection perhaps rivals his books collection, and his penchant for using non-smartphones is legendary. He once had a cat named Trumper, and he said no to the option of a lift from Shane Warne. Soon after the Warne book got published, we got to know his highest score in great cricket was 92 runs, and during the course of the conversation today, we'll hopefully find out the latest on that. I'm talking about the wonderfully brilliant Gideon Haigh, whose crowning achievement after today will always be the fact that he's a friend of the friendliest cricket podcast, Bits and Pieces. Welcome to our podcast, Gideon. Very glad to have you here. I'm Abhishek, and with me are Murali, Samir, Karthik, and of course, Mohan Krishnamurthy. And Mohan, you perhaps have a few bits and pieces to add to Gideon's introduction.
I will, and after that we'll get stuck into the questions and so on, which I'm sure all of us are really keen to pose to Gideon. My intro is more sort of Melbourne centric and cricket centric, particularly South Yarra cricket centric. So if you're walking or like me running along Como East or Alexandra Avenue on a Saturday or a Sunday afternoon, you're very likely to see Gideon Haigh batting at the South Yarra Oval, fielding as well. At one of these South Yarra Ovals, they have two. Gideon is as passionate about South Yarra and grassroots cricket as he is about cricket writing and cricket journalism in general, and journalism in general, and writing in general. He does a lot of behind the scenes work and contributes to club cricket in a substantial way. A few years back, the local council wanted to collapse the two Yarra ovals into one. Gideon threw his weight behind South Yarra retaining its two ovals, and that plan luckily got shelved. His heart beats for cricket and of course for South Yarra cricket and for grassroots cricket. This may not come across as a massive compliment, Gideon, but you share one thing in common with Gavaskar, apart from the fact that your names start with the letter G. Like Gavaskar, Gideon has never worn a helmet while batting, is what I've been told. I've seen him play, and he plays without a helmet or a hat or a cap. And that's where the difference with Gavaskar lies. Gavaskar used to bat with a floppy hat. So if you're jogging along Alexandra Avenue and if you see a batsman sans helmet or cap or hat, it's likely that is Gideon. Of course, if you see a batsman flick a ball elegantly to square leg, that's likely to be Gideon as well. He's known as one of the most elegant and technically correct batsmen for South Yarra cricket.
It's about my own shot, Mohan.
Sorry,
got that leg side flick. God help me if the captain blocks it up.
Indeed, yes, indeed. Okay, your tricks are all out. But for all his passion, sweat, and love for South Yarra cricket, here's a fun fact, and I hope Gideon will correct that if I'm wrong. Gideon plays third, fourth, fifth, and sometimes the seconds for South Yarra. But if I and my sources are right, Gideon has only ever won one flag in his entire cricketing career, and that was, if I'm not mistaken, in 2015. Would that be right?
It's right, absolutely right.
So that was 2015 that he won his only flag for in any form of cricket.
I've played
So
in
clearly,
8 Eastern Grand Finals, Mohan.
there you go. There you go. So clearly, passion and technique can only account for so much. Anyway, so Gideon, welcome to the podcast. We all know that you're a thoroughly grounded and a thoroughly humble person. So please be completely prepared to be embarrassed over the next 45 minutes or so. You've completely entered fanboy zone. Okay.
Right, okay. Well, I'm
The-
a very humble cricketer, and I've got a lot to be humble about.
So the five of us are massive fans, and we had to lock the door on the rest of the 20 who wanted to be flies on the wall on this particular podcast. We'll obviously talk a lot about your cricket writing, your cricket playing, and before we get there, though, there's probably another entire podcast to be reserved for your non-cricket writing.
Yeah.
In particular, Shelf Life is a book that I'd like to explore with you.
Yeah, sure.
You wrote about airline food, you wrote about architecture, depression, maps, proliferation of subtitles, and a whole bunch of other things in that book. And that's probably another podcast waiting. And also perhaps talking about self-publishing, the YouTubing of writing, if you like, right? So,
Yeah.
and where that's going and what that might do to writing in itself. But you're a self-publisher. But let's stick to cricket if
Sure.
possible. Gideon, first of all, reflections on the Gavaskar Trophy third test that just concluded. But then more generally, given the amount of cricket that's being played today, in
Yeah.
this podcast, we counted something like 18 Premier Leagues around the world. And then
Yeah.
you have ODIs, T20 games, and a whole bunch of other things. Given that, what does it give? What does it do to sort of journalism as we used to know it? The reportage of the daily reports, the cricket reporting that used to happen.
You are
Match
stretched
reports
thin.
and so on.
There's no doubt about that. And we're talking about women's cricket as well as men's cricket these days.
Yes,
So,
of course.
it's becoming very, very difficult to be a comprehensive cricket writer, to give a comprehensive sense of the way in which the game is going, because I don't think the game knows it itself. You're always trying to render coherence into something that's fundamentally pretty fragmented and pretty disorderly. Sometimes you're assuming that people know more than you do, and that's not always the case. I think there's a lot of short-term thinking. I think there's a lot of profit-mindedness where cricket's concerned these days. Ultimately, money is the driver of an awful lot of behaviours in the absence of anything else, in the absence of any kind of overriding sense of spirit or generalised objective. It's a pretty chaotic landscape, which isn't to say that it's not enjoyable, that it doesn't throw up fascinating interludes and ultimately cricketers, at least as I've found them, still love the game. Something very reassuring about that, about how passionate they are about doing what they do well. And it's been very interesting to watch this Australian team under pressure in India, in the most kind of potentially hostile landscape in cricket, but gradually coming to terms with it. And in this particular test, showing a bit of the resilience that they told us that they developed over the last year, playing in Pakistan and Sri Lanka, showing a willingness to accept the conditions as they find them and to see the game as presenting skills that they still have to learn. It's actually been a very humble performance by Australia. They was very confused after the Nagpur test. I think that it was a bit of a shock to the system. I think they went into the series extremely keyed up and perhaps a little bit manic in the way in which they approached that first innings on the first day in Nagpur. And of course, once you're behind it in India, it's very difficult to catch up. Delhi, they had a moment where they probably thought they were in the driver's seat in that game. And then they saw how quickly things can turn. You can lose a test match in an hour in this country. It's and nothing can happen for long periods. And then all of a sudden it's everything all at once everywhere. But in this test match, they have subtly changed their approach, I think. Early on in the tour, there was a lot of talk about how the pitches over here were lethal. You had to be proactive, you had to be aggressive, you had to put the bowler under pressure, you had to bat with intent. And because we kept hearing this recurrent phrase, there's a ball out there with your name on it. And I heard this the first time, I heard it the second time, heard it the third and fourth, fifth time, and I thought, this is a very bad mentality to take into Test match batting. You shouldn't be thinking about getting out when you're batting. In fact, to me, it's the begetter of all sorts of eccentric behaviour, and the Australian batsmen have cut quite a few weird capers in the first two Test matches. Well, interestingly, at the press conference before this Test match, Steve Smith used that phrase, and then he said, I don't like that phrase very much. And I went, good on you, Steve.
Good on you.
Good for you. Okay. And they
I always say, Gideon.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether I very much doubt that he's read any of my colleagues, my columns deploring this mentality, but they did approach this game as though they were capable of trusting their defence, of batting for time. They didn't get a huge total, but batsmen didn't get themselves out here. They were got out. And unlike India, who played a bizarre collection, very eccentric collection of shots from the get-go from their captain on the first day.
Absolutely.
How often do you see a captain stumped in the first hour of a Test match? It set a poor example. There was a touch of arrogance about India in this game. They just thought they had to show up. There was all this grandiloquent talk beforehand about, we might prepare a green seamer in Ahmedabad for practice for the World Test
WTC
final.
Mm-hmm.
That's a team getting well ahead of itself.
Yeah.
They thought Australia was beaten, and I take my hat off to the Australians. They've played much the better cricket these last 3 days, and they've thrown the switch in this series. It's going to be fascinating to see what gets turned out in Ahmedabad, with the additional weird overhang of the presence of the respective prime ministers.
Prime ministers, yeah, indeed.
Yeah, this is the Modi Stadium spectacular. India will be under pressure to perform for their national emperor.
Funny you use that word.
I just want to.
Can I just say one thing, Sami? One second. I often say this about the ball with your name on it. The only batsman who ever needed to be worried about a ball with his name on it would have been Sunil Gavaskar because of the SG balls. That's the and I don't know any cricketer called Kookaburra. So what the
I
hell?
suspect that Ashwin was actually searching for the ball with the name on it, which is why they changed it 3 times yesterday. Still didn't get any success out of it, but yeah.
Yes.
And also, I just want to point out the fascinating genius of Gideon Haigh, who just said it'll be fascinating to see what turns up in Ahmedabad after this. So yeah, I mean, we are equally curious about it. I mean, the pitch is going to be a rank turner, if any. So yeah. I think it's a bygone conclusion at this point.
I mean, I think it's been high 30s and in Ahmedabad the last few days. If you can produce a green seamer in that time, good luck.
Good luck to you.
But Gideon,
thanks. Yeah.
So sorry, I was just wondering, you didn't really talk or worry too much about the pitch aspect of it, which is the part that they spoke so much about, especially when they were coming to Indore last minute. You don't think the pitch had that much of a role to play? It was just application?
Look, I think the pitches are in the batsmen's minds now. This was the poorest of the 3 pitches. There's no doubt about that. But I mean, essentially, you know that both teams have to bat on it. You know that it's going to be just as difficult for your opposition as you do. I think the Australians managed to get over their negativity here and really apply themselves. I thought that spell on the first hour of the 3rd day where Hanscom and Green, defended and set themselves to last. They put on 40 and 134 balls. That wasn't the team that played in the first 2 Test matches. That was a team that was really trying to find a way to survive. I mean, I know it's important to think about scoring, but frankly, you can't score if you don't survive. And so survival really should come first here.
Indeed, yes. So Gideon, maybe if it's okay with you, we'll move away from the Gavaskar Trophy. We can talk for hours about that, and go into more generalized territory about your writing itself. And I want to start by asking, and then we'll all take turns asking a few questions about your writing itself. I want to start, if possible, by talking about the way you construct your autobiographies on hagiographies on like Shane Warne and of course the Sultan, which I'm sure all of us have read it. So what's the process that you undertake before? Do they come to you? Do you go to them with an idea? And the other question follow up is, do you have a hypothesis when you start writing, or a framework when you start writing, and then explore the subject and of the
Oh,
or,
I
I mean,
wish.
what's your process?
I wish. I mean, I write in order to find out what I think. I tend to think in print. I tend to just start and see where I end up. The Warne book, it's funny, that was suggested to me by a publisher, by a guy called Ben Ball at Penguin.
Mhm.
I had never thought of doing a book on Warne. I'd written quite extensively about Warne, and I liked him, and of course I admired him, but I'd never thought of writing a book about him. It was just too obvious, frankly. But then I thought I had like, I think you mentioned, I wrote it in a month. I wrote it in a month at the end of the season, in March, at the end of a cricket season. And I just thought, well, let's have fun with this. Because if anything, if Warne was about anything, it was about fun. He gave you the impression of hugely enjoying whatever it was that he was doing. And if you can't enjoy writing about Warne, then you really should reconsider your vocation. He is an absolute, he is the loveliest subject. You can twist him this way and twist him that, and look at him from all sorts of different angles. And there are great individual feats to talk about. There's a fascinating personality. There's the wider context of the game in which he's found himself. There's his relationship to Australia. There's his relationship to England, to India. Ultimately, you didn't have to tell the whole story of Shane Warne either, because the story was so well known. It's almost folkloric in its dimensions. So you could kind of pick the bits out of Warne that you found interesting, the particular facets of Warne that best lent themselves to kind of critical exploration. And I broke it down into 5 subject areas. They're essentially 5 interlocking essays. And I hate to say it, but the book wrote itself, really. He's an absolute gift. It was the easiest piece of writing I've ever done. And lo and behold, I'm still writing about him. I wrote another piece about him yesterday because
The anniversary.
it was the anniversary of his passing. Look, endlessly fascinating. And I didn't need to talk to Warne for the course of doing this book. I'd spoken to him extensively over the years. I felt as though I had a pretty good understanding of him. I had a pretty good simpatico with him.
Oh.
He's not, he's, what you see is what you get with Warne. That's one of the things that's most appealing about him, is that he surrenders himself to interrogation pretty easily. Wow. I did it. He was fine about it. He was really good. I stayed, I continued having friendly relations with him, which not every one of his biographers can say about him. He used to call me the professor. He used to greet me as professor. I wear glasses and I look kind of studious. So Warnie loved to come up with a nickname for everyone. So it would be professor with me. The Wasim Akram book, that came about through an approach from Wasim's wife, Shanira. Funny enough, it came through grassroots cricket. For years, I've been playing cricket against a guy called Tim Cherry, who plays for Sacred Heart in the Mercantile Cricket Association. His sister is a friend of Shanira Akram's. So Shanira was able to get my contact details from her. And she contacted me and said, Wasim is interested in doing a book, or I would like him to do a book, because I think Shanira was the great advocate for Wasim telling his story. I think Wasim was a little bit more reticent. Was, after all, 20 years since he stopped playing international cricket, and he hadn't done a book at the end of his career. He'd left a lot of tales untold. But Shanira's argument was, well, Wasim has two boys in their 20s, and he has a daughter who's 8 years old. They have no independent recollection of their father playing cricket. So it would be a good thing, Shanira thought, if Wasim was to do a book that kind of explained to his children who he is and where he's from. And that, you know, to give his side of the stories which circulate about him. He was a very obliging co-author. He's an extremely courteous man. He's an extremely warm-hearted and generous man. He's a good storyteller. He's not a great self-mythologizer. He's, you know, he doesn't surrender. He's not a big noter by any means, but he has a solid core of confidence and a sense of pride about what he achieved. You know, he's an interesting mixture of the very cosmopolitan, in the sense that he is extremely well traveled and at home everywhere in the world, and the intensely Pakistani. You know, he is a very patriotic man at the same time. You know, he still lives in Karachi most of the time. He identifies very strongly with his nation and the national project. Of course, he's a close friend of Imran Khan's, but he's also capable of blending in Melbourne. He has a house in Melbourne, and he has a house in Manchester. He's still got a great sense of allegiance to Lancashire, where he played county cricket for 10 years. So he's a real kaleidoscope, and in that sense, a very interesting subject to write about. There was the interesting question of finding what was the right voice for Wasim, because, you know, you don't write as you speak or speak as you write. I had to find a written voice for someone who is not actually a writer. So I groped for that. I think I found something that was satisfactory, and I was able to put sort of an undergirding of factual information in the narrative, just by sort of diligent research.
And both books that you refer to, the biographies, are so easy to read, even for the non-cricket writer, and that's something that non-cricket enthusiast, and that's something that you know, it's a credit to the writing, as well as the construction of the overall narrative. Yeah.
Something interesting about doing a biography that's 20 years after a player retired, I actually think it's advantageous. Very few cricketers would withstand that, because, frankly, the imperative is to get a book out almost as soon as the player has retired, in order to capitalise on their residual fame. Wasim is one where you could come back a long time afterwards, and the process gained from the elapsure of time and the context in which Wasim could now see his career, because there'd been a post-cricketing stage of Wasim's life that changed his relationship to his experiences as a player.
But this is Wasim that we're talking about. I mean, he's probably, I mean, even if you talk to cricketers today, they'll say the best fast bowler, Wasim. You know,
I mean, you write this book 200 years later, I think you can still write it. Wasim Akram is
Part of the fun was going to other contemporaries of Wasim's and asking them for tributes, and everyone signed up straight away. You know, they were instantly enthusiastic about it, because if you love cricket, just love Wasim.
Absolutely. Abhishek.
Kart, you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. Very quickly. Yes. So Gideon, if you know only one thing or two things about our podcast, one of them is we hate English cricket. Notice how I didn't say the English, I said English cricket, right? And that's an undercurrent that goes right through, our entire group. And the other thing is we love the IPL, right? The cricket, the ads, all of us except one notable, holdout who is nodding, who is shaking his head very vigorously, right? But anyway, what I really wanted to ask you about, I think, is at the intersection of those two. One of the things that really struck with me, and you might find this odd because, we've read a lot of your writing. We're all fans of a lot of your writing. But one of the things that really stuck with me was the foreword that you wrote for War Minus the Shooting, the republication of it, Mike Marquis's book. That, by the way, is, I think, the third strand in our group. We're all huge fans of Mike Marquis, and who that follows cricket is not, right? And, there's not a day that doesn't go by where I don't find myself cursing my luck that we don't have a writer like that we can read week after week, write a tour diary or comment about the goings on in cricket. And I think, as you point out, even in your foreword, right, he was so remarkably prescient even 20 years ago, 30 years ago, right? So I guess I really just want to ask you, if you were to expand that foreword, right, which was maybe 2 pages, right, and you had to speak a little bit about Mike Marquis and what he would think about cricket today, do you have thoughts on that? I'm sure you've thought about it.
I think he'd be feeling vindicated. I think he identified trends or structural underpinnings in Indian cricket in the course of that 1996 World Cup that have verily come to pass. The stealth corporate takeover of Indian cricket. Well, it's not so stealthy anymore. And the underpinnings of a very strident nationalism, which now totally pervades the BCCI. I think it's almost open to us to conclude that the BCCI has become part of the propaganda wing of the BJP. That's one of the reasons why we're getting the pictures we are in this Test series, because India cannot lose. It's just too humiliating for the ruling classes or the ruling party in India to have the nationalist project dented in any way. And so, Mike was absolutely on the money. It's one of those books that repays constant rereading, and the same is true of anyone but England. I think that a lot of his critiques of English cricket are absolutely on the money. It is sad that we don't have more writers of Marquis's caliber. I think writing about cricket is, like I said before, it's now become so kind of all-consuming, so demanding, so relentless, such a grind that it's difficult to come and go. So much is changing on an almost monthly basis that you can look around and the game's completely different to the last time you looked at it. Even now, I'm sort of more or less employed full time on cricket. There are days when I wake up and I don't know what's coming next. I have absolutely no idea. I don't know how the players cope with it. I guess they just take it one day at a time, and they reconcile themselves to what's on offer. But it's a very unpredictable landscape, and I don't think anyone quite knows how it's going to end up.
Quite sad we don't have a book called Sport Minus the Looting, because it would be very representative of what's going on in India right now.
But I think that is a very valid point, Gideon, that I don't know that we have writers today necessarily who come from, I mean, if you looked at Mike Marquis, he just came from such a completely different background, right? And he wrote about cricket. And
okay.
I think the other thing is that that perhaps Mike didn't explore, although he probably hinted at it. We became very exercised in the 1990s and the 2000s about player corruption. We've showed precious little interest in administrative corruption, and I think it's much more pervasive than we let on. And as I think it was Thomas Jefferson said, strictly speaking, the more money, the less virtue. There's a hell of a lot of money around now. You cannot possibly keep track of it all, and it's not where the money's coming from so much as where the money is going. And I think that's a subject that fills me with disquiet. The way in which the spoils of this now incredibly wealthy game are being distributed.
It's all going to Bollywood. There are lots of movies being made on this. So
Yeah, well, I mean, interestingly, we talk about the IPL as being this huge payday for the players. If you look at what the players are paid, it's actually not all that much relative to how huge that competition is.
it's massive.
Contracts haven't increased in size to the degree that the commercial rights of the IPL have expanded.
It's massive.
The players are really being exploited at the moment, and that's because, of course, there's no peak body for them. There's no union for the players in India. They're happy enough with what they're getting. If the players really pushed back in India, it would be a very interesting confrontation.
Mohan, this is where you bring in your favorite word, monopsony.
Monopsony.
Hey, great word. Great word.
I mean, and we've talked about this on the on this podcast before. It's not a monopoly, but obviously a monopsony. But it's incredible. But anyway, that's a different podcast. That's another podcast in its own right. And I think we should do that. But yeah.
But Gideon, you have to be pro IPL or anti IPL. Which side would you sway? Remember, there's a lot riding on you right now. Mohan's watching.
I watch the IPL and I enjoy watching it, but then again, I enjoy watching most forms of cricket. The thing that's always concerned me about the advent of T20 is its second and third order effects on the rest of cricket. You're kind of it's feeding on the same audiences, it's tapping the same well springs of talent, and in the end, however much the game expands, money and attention and focus and prestige will end up in a different place. So yeah.
And to anecdotally also mention, it also breeds cricketers for that format, right? I think Will Smeed, or even the most famous example being Hardik Pandya, who only had this constraint of playing on the leg side, right? Like you start to see examples like this, which may, I think, say 10 years down the line, be detrimental to Test cricket. You never know, right? But that's happening as we speak, right? So,
I mean, I did a book last year with Dan Christian about his year of T20 because I'd always wanted to read a book from the inside of T20. I don't think T20 has the literature it deserves. I think people have been too busy raking in money to really contemplate what it's like to be in that system. I mean, Dan's a very mature cricketer. Dan's seen a lot and done a lot and played all over the world, and he has a context into which he can fit this stage of his career. A lot of other players, that's the only world they know and will ever know.
Yeah.
Which will give them a distorted sense of cricket's values and potentialities.
Gideon, very early in the piece when T20 came into force, I remember reading, I think it may have been Sidvi who said, cricket, T20 needs its own ontology. There's no, I mean, what is a spell in T20? A spell in Test cricket is 6-8 overs. What's a spell in T20? So it needs its own vocabulary and its own ontology. But anyway, I think
I'll go next.
Yeah, go.
So Gideon, going very, very far back in time now from the IPL discussion, my favorite book of yours is Stroke of Genius, the Trumper book that you wrote.
Thanks, Abhishek. Thank you.
And there's a quote by, I think, an Australian historian called Demning, where you contrast the nature or the act of sporting achievement and the revelation of it.
Yes.
And I mean, I think of that when I think of the story that you tell us about John Goff in that book, the Sydney Shires cricketer who was in Chatswood School or something. So, I mean, what I'd like you to do perhaps is tell us the story in your own words, and also explain, how playing cricket for you, as Mohan mentioned at the top of the podcast, how has that sort of influenced your writing?
Yeah, look, it's a while ago since I spoke to John Goff, but I remember when he was at school and at the principal's office, wasn't there? There was that photo of Victor Trumper, the George Goldman of him jumping out the drive. So whenever he had to see the principal for various indiscretions, he would always concentrate on that photo, and he found it absolutely spellbinding. And it had a similar effect on me. Trumper was the first historic cricketer I ever really got excited about. I remember I read, it was the Centenary Test program, 1977, and it had a profile of Trumper written by Neville Cardis from that book, Cricket, the Great Ones. And he was made to sound like such a magical figure, such a spellbinding figure that I wanted to know more. I was immediately in his camp. I immediately kind of identified him. I immediately wanted to champion his cause. And the associations that we form when young are the ones that we are most ardent about.
Yeah.
I always imagined somehow getting around to writing a book about Trumper. I wasn't quite sure what it was going to be like. I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to say, but I eventually decided that I would write not a biography of the man, because he's a slightly elusive character, difficult to write about so long ago. Everyone who had direct contact with him is gone, and much of the writing about him is invested with sort of mythological significances. But a biography of the legend of Trumper, and the legend is to a very great degree based on that photograph and also the kind of canonical writings about him. There's an emotional incandescence to the writing about Trumper that I don't think is the case for any other figure. The figures of W.G. Grace and Donald Bradman inspire, or Trumper inspires love, almost a romantic love. He's a little bit like a Galahad character. There's something almost Arthurian about his legend. There's an innocence. There's a lightness to Trumper that I don't associate with any other cricketer, and that's uncommon in Australia. That's not the kind of cricket that we normally identify with. We're tough, we're gritty, we're competitive, we're aggressive.
We don't give a thumbs up to someone who's bowled well.
That's right. Yeah, a very Trumperian thing to do, actually. So I set out to write that book. I'm not sure whether I succeeded or failed, but I certainly got the book kind of out of my system. I was glad when I'd finished it. I'd done what I had to do by Victor.
But would you say perhaps R.T. Jackson is a similar sort of character?
Yes, yeah, I think so. I unheard melodies are sweetest, as we know, and we reserve a particular affection or allegiance for the prematurely slain, and I guess that probably counts where Trump is concerned. Even though, if you think about it, he actually lived not that far short of the life expectancy of his own period.
Yeah,
and,
that's true.
And of course, I sense there are resonances with the First World War. Even though Trumper was not a war casualty, in some respects, mourning Trumper was mourning a lost Australia, a lost time, a lost golden age. In fact, when Neville Cardis wrote about Trumper's evanescence or his last efflorescence, he was mourning a lost England of peace and plenty.
Yeah. So for the benefit of the listeners, the quote that Gideon used in the Warne book is by this guy called Greg Denning. Nothing is so fleeting as a sporting achievement, and nothing is so lasting as the revelation of it.
It's a good line. I've used it a few times, actually. I talked to Greg Denning on a few occasions. I never asked him about that line, but it's a good one.
Yeah.
And in Trumper's case, of course, it has this physical form. It has the artifact of this photograph, and it's a very early photograph. It's a very remarkable photograph. It looks quite unlike the other photographs of that era.
It's quite amazing.
The front foot off the ground, the bat at the limit of its backlift, the blurring of the background, the crease falling away in one direction, the sky appearing in the upper right hand corner. It's a narrative of an entire stroke, an entire way of playing the game. And in that sense, I'm not surprised that people find it kind of captivating.
Yeah.
I looked at it again and again, and there is something in that photograph new every time you look at it.
Absolutely. Lovely. Murali, you want to go next?
I'd be kind enough to let Samir go, man. He's been waiting with a question for a while.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Murali. But before the question, I just want to share a small anecdote to Gideon. So this is a recent incident. So there's a bookstore that's called Bookworm in Bangalore. It's one of my favorite go-to haunts. So and this is a place a decade ago, which used to be run out of a small place, very niche. The owner used to know you by face, know your recommendations and all of that. So imagine my surprise when Sultan launched. He actually decked out the entire front with all Sultan books. There was a Warne book and every possible cricket book that he could get a hands on. And a week later, he tells me that he's placed an order for 100 more books of Sultan because his first lot was gone. So I think that's the tremendous response that Sultan has had from India. If you can just multiply that by 10x, that's how much that book has permeated to the public conscience. And I think Wasim also writes very fondly about his time in Chinnaswamy, which is barely 350 meters from the bookstore. So I find it very delicious that I read that specific paragraph.
Samir, is that why he counts Gavaskar Srinath as one of the best?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Gavaskar Srinath, who also happens to be a Bangalorean and from my neck of woods. I hail from Mysore. So, yeah, I mean, I just hope to bump into him sometime in a morning run because he's often seen on morning runs there. But yeah, an anecdote aside, I just want to travel a little further in time from Choppy and talk about Kerry Parker's WSC, right? I'm guilty of reading that book very late. I think I have a 40th edition copy of it. I mean, I discovered it in the last 4 or 5 years. And what I find fascinating is the kind of clandestine nature of the whole WSC, right? I mean, I can easily juxtapose that with an IPL and say this is, IPL was really out there. I think ever since India won the T20, IPL dominated news cycles, wherein WSC was always this rebel league. And I also remember snatches of a rebel league that was formed in Indian cricket. Yes. I'm just trying to understand from you, right? Like Ian Chappell, there's an anecdote about Ian Chappell taking his closest friend, a car dealer, out of town over lunch and then inducting him into the circle. What are some of these stories that didn't make it to the book? And, is there any parallel that we can draw to instances today?
I mean, interestingly, when I did that book, this is 1992 we're talking about, it was only 15 years after World Series cricket. And there were still wounds in the establishment's flank and among the signatories. I think the signatories still felt a kind of a residual disappointment at the way in which they were exiled from the official game. And the official game still felt a sense of betrayal about players colluding with a private investor to exploit the talents that establishment cricket had helped nurture. I think that's blown over to a certain degree now. I think people have a context for World Series cricket. They see it as a kind of presaging changes and innovations that the game had need of, equipping it for the next generation, which would not have occurred with cricket's existing institutional structures. And I think we've perhaps now tilted over to the degree where we think of everything that World Series cricket now was to the good. Everything was beneficial. It's strange how history gets written. My book was the first attempt to try to tell the story from the point of view of the rebels, to see, to understand their motivations, to explain the kind of the forces that World Series cricket liberated. If I'd been writing it 20 years later, it might have been a different book. I sort of always try to lean slightly against the grain of common thinking at the time. I encountered a bit of hostility along the way. I think quite a few people wouldn't speak to me because it was assumed that a writer could only be hostile to World Series cricket. However, I was fortunate in that I did make the acquaintance of Ian Chappell early on, and his word counts for a lot. As far as cricketers are concerned, Ian has a authority and a charisma that I don't think I have seen matched. In some respects, to the players of his generation, he's still the captain. If you meet Ian, he looks you straight in the eye. He's got these cold blue eyes. He looks you straight in the eye. He gives you a firm handshake, and he talks straight about absolutely everything. So when you encounter someone like that, they're unusual. You know, he doesn't hedge his bets, Ian, and if you're on his side, then he's fantastically loyal. You know, he looks after people. So in that sense, I feel quite fortunate to have had him as not a friend. I mean, I don't think it's possible to be friends with the people that you write about, but certainly I've always had a really good, robust relationship with Ian. He's good company and a good man.
Fantastic raconteur as well. Just tells so many stories as well.
Yeah.
Yep.
And just as a part of a ritual of the spot, I did find the tweet that Bookworm had put out when Sultan has released. So this will be linked in the show notes, and I will dropping it in the chat here just so that people can see it. Not the actual image. I tried finding it on my phone. So yeah, there's that.
It's also a testimony to the fact that a lot of Indians secretly like Pakistanis, Gideon. So don't let anything fool you. We love Pakistanis and we're going to buy the books, but we'll never say it out loud. You will see us.
We do. We've actually bemoaned quite a bit on this podcast, and there are other people that do that too, that no Pakistani cricketer has actually got a contract in the IPL. And it's an absolute shame that's it has to be called out routinely and repeatedly. Yes. And I have a question on that, but let's Murali, let Murali go.
Yeah, I'll continue on this vein. Is actually my question is on the same line, right? Because there is this cute theory that if some of us admit that our favorite cricketer is a Pakistani, we'll be deemed an anti-national. So we never really took that tone. But my question is right on those lines, Gideon. Actually, as an Englishman growing up in Australia, what drastic, and it's beautiful because during the time you spoke about Trumper as well, you used the term we a lot. So I know that you're core Australian at heart. So what are the cultural cricketing experiences you've seen between Australian cricket and English cricket? And on that vein, what are your thoughts about the Australian style of cricket? And do you think Pat Cummins is changing the dynamics of and the representation of that?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I was born in England, you're right. My father was English, my mother was Australian. I certainly don't regard myself as English.
And thank you
friend
for
of
that.
The pod, friend of the pod.
Passport. I've lived in Australia, I've got no desire to live anywhere else. However, I think growing up, I always had a sense of being slightly different. And originally I kind of ascribed that to my Englishness, or to my English birth. I thought, there's something, I don't sit completely easily in this landscape. I feel a certain sort of, not discomfort, but I don't feel automatically at home. I've realised subsequently that I don't feel really at home anywhere. I probably feel as at home in India as I do anywhere else. I just think that, I'm slightly uneasy. I've got a slightly uneasy relationship with all the environments that I find myself in. I mean, when I went to England for the first time, I didn't go back to England until I was 19. And I liked the place, but I'd never felt so intensely as Australian as I did when I went to England. I've always been a kind of a critic of whatever kind of place I found myself in. I've been critical of Australian cricket. I've been intensely critical of Cricket Australia over the years, despite the fact that I'm also their official historian. I don't know. I'm just impatient with cant and hypocrisy. And if there's something I don't like, then I will call it out.
Which brings me to a question, and and it's really important in the context of where this podcast is set. Sorry to interrupt you, but if we contrast that with the situation in India, and that's a very, very important pivot and an important context as well. Critical India writing or anti-India writing, even you talked about being anti-establishmentarian with respect to Cricket Australia, and I've read some of those pieces. But critical India writing is not tolerated.
No,
Is just not tolerated or enjoyed even. So how do you write, in this kind of context from an India perspective? How do you write in a way that gets the message across, but yet appears balanced? Because if you write something critical, you're going to get 1 million hits on Twitter.
sure, yeah. Well, I would never know anything about that because I'm not on Twitter.
Yes, that's one of the advantages of not being on Twitter.
That makes life a lot easier, frankly.
You get 1 million hits here as well, Gideon, but it won't be on Twitter. So you should be very careful.
I just drop these pieces and I've got no idea where they end up. No idea. And I'm not really interested. I'm just, tell the truth and shame the devil. That's always been my approach. I also, Mohan mentioned before that I write about different things. I'm first and foremost a journalist who writes about cricket. I'm not a cricket journalist. And if my cricket writing ended tomorrow, if for whatever reason I was prevented from earning a livelihood from cricket, I'd just go on to something else. I'd still love the game, but it wouldn't trouble me. I have no fear of being excommunicated from cricket for something that I say. I'm not sure there's too many ways that they can't cut off my access. They can't. It's not like I have a vested interest in building a career in cricket. I don't want to do any more than I do now, which is write the things that interest me and have fun.
And that's the thing, right? The voice is important, because otherwise everyone toes the totalitarianism line. It's just impossible to be anything else. Thank you.
Yeah. Gideon, how are we doing on time? Would you want to end soon?
A few more questions is okay? Yeah.
Wonderful.
Okay, so Mohan, should we break into the quickfire? And
we'll leave the quickfire for the last 5 minutes. We got about 5 or 6 quickfires. So Chops, why did you ask one more? We'll edit all this up.
Okay, cool. No, I'll perhaps let Kart have another go at one more question. I just had the John Goff question.
Certainly. Yeah, I always. Yes. So one of the things, Gideon, I wanted to ask more about, and you actually spoke about quite a bit of it, even without prompting, was Ian Chappell, the man, and not just the man himself, but, Chappell, the cricketer, the captain, the man, and more importantly, the activist, right? So he's done a lot of work recently in the past, decades on immigrant rights within Australia. And I think that's an incredibly important story around the world. We see what happens in Europe. We see what happens, on the US border, all over Asia, in Australia, and so on. And I don't know that there is another parallel for a cricketer of such stature being so involved with issues like these and being so outspoken about it and being so firm in his stance, so much after his career. So just, if you can talk a little bit about Chappell. Ian Chappell is my favorite Australian player by far, and I think he is a object of much fascination and admiration for a lot of people, not just, Indian cricket fans and, necessarily. So yeah, if could you just talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. I mean, I think, from my very earliest dealings with Ian, he has always called it as he saw it. And there's something very admirable and authentic about that. I can remember early on, I had a conversation with Ian where he offered some very trenchant views about someone or other. And I said, "Oh, Ian, are you happy?" I said, "Are you happy for me to quote you on that?" And he said, "Gideon, if I don't want you to fucking quote me, I won't fucking tell you." And I thought, that is a great, and I've actually stuck to that line myself. Yeah, absolutely. If you're prepared to offer an opinion, you should be prepared to stand behind it. It's one of the reasons why I don't like Twitter all that much. I find the anonymous expression of opinion to be just noise pollution, frankly. If you believe in something, then you've got to put your name to it. That's fundamental. His attitude to refugees, and you're right, he has been a very constructive and articulate advocate of refugee causes, comes about because apparently the story he tells is that one night he was watching a current affairs show about the plight of boat people, and he was grumbling about it, and his wife said to him, or offered up that great line of Edmund Burke's, which is, evil thrives when good men do nothing. If you actually believe this, then you should say so. And Ian found that persuasive logic. So yeah, he's every opportunity he has, Ian is on the side of the underdog, no matter where he finds them. In 1977, it was his cricketing contemporaries, and that's applied wherever he's gone. Sometimes I think Ian could afford to let other people look after him a bit better. He's a proud man. He's an independent man. He looks after other people. There's a lot about Ian to admire. He is not just a great cricketer, but a great Australian.
There are a few books waiting to be written there, I reckon.
I agree.
Absolutely.
And that's been
Great
the
man.
case about him. Ever since, Bill Lawry was captain in that South Africa tour. To have the gall to, get everyone together for that letter. To become the captain after that.
Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Always knowing that he was not the establishment's first pick.
Exactly.
He always had a sense that his career would be short. It was an ambivalent relationship that the Australian Cricket Board had with him. He'd be there for as long as he was useful.
Absolutely.
Gideon, you've been really gracious with your time. Thank you so much. One last question, and then we'll go into rapid fire. We're very aware that you have a full day ahead of you. So you're traveling at the moment, and this question is sort of contextualized in that in that context. Why do you reckon tour diaries have kind of lost favor as cricket literature, if you like? We have some classics in Australia, Australia 55 by Alan Ross, for example. And then more recently, one of my favorite books, Pundits from Pakistan by Rahul Bhattacharya. You and Peter Lalor, I think people here will, you're traveling around, you're doing your daily podcast, chronicling a whole heap of things, including the toilet museum that we talked about before, but not in written form. Are there lack of takers? I'd love to see, more tour diaries come about, not by cricketers, but people like you and Peter traveling around, like the Pundits book.
Yeah, the thing is that what's changed is tours. Tours are so short; they're so crowded. We've been able to do additional things on this tour, but the test matches have been so short. It's been a vintage tour for tourism because we've had lots of spare time. It is a shame, and of course, when you're part of the kind of the cricket bubble, it's quite difficult to get away from. And the other thing is that has changed is that deadlines are now every hour, not every 24 hours. The opportunity to detach and to recreate just isn't there. I'm lucky that in Peter I've got a very good and adaptable and peripatetic traveling companion, but I know that other journalists on the tour who aren't so experienced, they are very much caught up in the grinding gears of the tour, producing a non-stop supply of content.
Yeah.
Where they might, India is almost incidental. India is something they're seeing through the bus window. That's a great shame, actually. I mean, I love getting to India. I love that it's so completely different. I love that it's so uncompromising that you couldn't be anywhere else in the world. But it's very easy to kind of hang around the team hotel and the same sort of small group of restaurants looking for Australian beer and pizza. And you might as well not have left home.
Indeed, yes.
So, Gideon, we have a few quick fire questions for you, a few serious ones to start with, and then a few perhaps less serious ones.
And remember, you're not on Twitter, so you can answer honestly because you don't care what people think.
Okay. Favorite non-test ground in Australia?
Non-test ground, Como Park.
Surprise, surprise.
Yeah.
That is an easy one. Okay. Favorite India versus Australia test in India? Before BGT also.
Tide test, Chennai. Yep, 86. Yep.
Lovely.
Oh, yeah.
Favorite India versus Australia test in Australia?
Brisbane, on the last tour.
Last
Fantastic test.
Nice. And your favorite cricket author?
My favorite cricket author, among contemporary cricket journalists, it'd be Mike Atherton, good friend of mine. As far as contemporary historian, Ramchandra Guha, for his book Corner of a Foreign Field. And as far as tour books are concerned, Alan Ross, who you mentioned before, Australia 55 and Australia 63, benchmark.
And all-time favorite cricket writer, I mean, anyone else who's not a contemporary anymore?
R.C. Robertson Glasgow, who I absolutely love, Cricket Prince, 46 Not Out, How to Be a Test Cricketer, absolutely wonderful, aphoristic, sympathetic, thoughtful, humane, lovely man. Tragic end, but left behind a wonderful corpus of work.
So some binary quickfires, and you can justify your answer if you want to. And I think the first one everyone knows the answer to, but I'll ask anyway. Como Park or Shivaji Park?
Oh yeah, always Como Park.
Okay, I had to ask.
The funny thing is, isn't it, that they've got something in common? The overlapping grounds.
Exactly right.
But
there are two. There are two.
Shivaji Park too, and I actually. You're not correct in saying that I don't wear a hat. I do actually have a sun hat that I was given at Shivaji Park in 2015 by M.V. Gotchoka, the Indian umpire, author of a book called The Burning Finger, of which I'm immoderately fond. And he gave me a sun hat for, I think it's the VL Mandrake one-day tournament that they played. So I wear that with pride to this day.
Okay.
When it rains and I need something to keep the rain off my glasses, I call for my sun hat.
There you go. Well, so for people who are listening to this podcast, there is an overlap between the two ovals on Como Park, and it's just a small overlap, but there is actually an overlap. But at Shivaji Park, there's a overlap of about 100 games going on. Slightly more chaotic. Taylor or Border or War?
Border, I think.
Yeah. I
wrote a book about Border, and he's the most unassuming great cricketer that you've ever met. You would hardly pick him as a great cricketer. He doesn't carry himself like a great cricketer. He doesn't talk like a great cricketer. He's just the most incredibly average man. Lovely fellow.
Completely contrary to.
Go on.
Sorry, I was just going to ask, who do you think is the greatest Aussie Test captain ever? Was it Border or someone else?
Captain. I might say someone like Monty Noble.
Okay. Well, yeah.
All right, going on with the binaries. Lion or Ashwin? You're not on Twitter.
Well, I love Ashwin. I find him a fascinating cricketer. I like his batting. I like his intellect. I like his avidity for cricket. I think he's very articulate and interesting to listen to. But I've actually, on this tour, I've learned to admire Lion more. My view of Lion's been enhanced by this tour. He's really shown willing. You know, he got tailed up in Nagpur, but he's turned it around. And on the last day of this test match, or the second last test match, he was inspiring. He carried that team with him. We're fortunate to have two such great off spinners who are so different in method in the same generation.
Mm-hmm.
You know, off spin was thought to be a dying art 10 or 15 years ago. You had to be a Murali, you had to be a Sucklane, you had to bowl a huge variety of deliveries. In some senses, both these guys are classical off spinners in quite different ways, both wonderfully watchable. And look, I've been critical of the pitches here. I mean, everyone has, but the cricket has been absorbing. When lots of balls are being bowled every hour and batsmen's defences are being really tested, there is something spellbinding about it.
Which brings me to my next tongue-in-cheek, almost binary: dust bowl or green bowl?
Yeah, look, I'd probably go with the dust bowl. Yeah. I like seeing lots of balls bowled. I like lots of pressure around the bat. I like cricket in hot conditions. I really do. I mean, I've played some memorable cricket on hot days in Australia. There's something about pitting your physicality against climatic extreme that I find really stimulating. Even now at the age of 57, I like playing on hot day because you really know afterwards that you've played. That all goes to the discipline of maintaining concentration and competitive edge in testing circumstances. So yeah, dust bowl.
Brilliant. And finally, Shastri was called Shaz, right? So Baz ball or Shaz ball?
Well, I like Ravi. Ravi is a great fun. I'm very fond of him. Great guy. Look, but I've spent some time with Baz as well. They're both very good company. Wouldn't it be fascinating to see the two forces opposed? Matter and antimatter, the irresistible force and the immovable object.
There you go.
That's something to really conjure with.
And just one more before we let you go, Gideon. Any current cricketer, who is not yet retired, you think you watch his career, you watch him go about his thing, and you think, okay, this is a guy, whom I'm going to write a biography about in some years, probably, or maybe even an autobiography with him.
Look,
I just want to add an addendum. It could be a her also.
Yeah, of course.
Good point, actually. Good point. Look, among contemporary players, I mean, he didn't have a great game in here, but I love watching Shubman Gill. I think he's lovely to watch. And there's not a lot of beauty around in cricket these days. There's a lot of power around, but there's not a lot of old-fashioned elegance. He's a touch player. He reminds me of some of the best touch players of India that I've seen. I'm looking forward to watching him for the next 10 years. I really hope he keeps his place. There's a real stamp of quality about him. Who else do I like? Well, I'm enjoying watching Harry Brook at the moment. I find it actually quite difficult to fit him into sort of the pantheon of England greats. He's obviously got his own method. he looks quite different to a Joe Root or a Michael Vaughan or a Trescothick, or to name some of the other distinguished English players of recent vintage. He goes his own way, and there's something about a cricketer who kind of almost discovers the game or deduces the game from first principles. That's kind of fascinating to watch. I often thought that of Warne, that it wasn't as though he went out to imitate anyone. He kind of just discovered leg spin on his own. I mean, he expressed some affection for Abdul Qadir, but it wasn't as though he modeled himself on anyone. He just sort of worked out, this is what you do. There's something about that. A cricketer who really owns their method, who's not a manufactured cricketer, is always one that's easy on the eye and easy to get captivated by.
Okay.
I'm very eager and excited to see your autobiography going for the Gill in about 15 years, Gideon. We're very excited. It'll be great for your ride about Indian.
Well, look, there's nothing to stop him really, apart from forces outside his control, because he's got the game. He seems to have the temperament. He seems to have the talent. It'll be a test of Indian cricket as to what they get out of Shubman Gill, because it's all there.
And Gideon, have you managed to cross 92 as your highest score?
I have actually. I have. 92, you're right, is my highest score for the Yarras. I batted all day for that. I have to say, I was first in and last out. I made 100 in England in 2013. Playing for a team called Old Sorbet Keen. It was a team put together by Simon Lister, who's a producer at the BBC, a wandering 11. I played a game at a village. It wasn't that impressive, I must say. I sort of got to about 10. I thought, if I'm ever going to make 100, it's probably going to be today, because this is the highest standard of competition. And it was fun enough, it was on the day that Andy Murray won Wimbledon. So there were these periodic bursts of applause from the and after a while I realized they had nothing to do with that.
Okay. On that note, Gideon, thank you so much for making time for us. It's been a real pleasure. I would even go as far as saying it's honestly been a dream come true to be able to talk to you and to see you on our screens. We hope you have a great time during the rest of the tour. And we hope to keep reading whatever you write and whatever you talk about on cricket, etc. Thank you so much.
Thanks for reading. It's always interesting to meet readers. I'm never quite sure when I write something whether anyone's reading it out there at all. But so it's nice to know that you're out there. Thanks very much for being so appreciative.
Thank you, Gideon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gideon.
Cheers.
That's been episode 61 of Bits and Pieces with a very special guest, Gideon Haigh. Please keep giving all your love to our podcast. Keep sharing it with your friends, and keep tuning in for all our episodes. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome.